Hello and welcome to Our Shakespeare, the channel where I talk about Shakespeare from a 21st century American perspective. And this, the second episode of my video series, What the Shakespeare, where I explain a Shakespeare subject that isn't necessarily one of his plays. Today, I'm going to talk about the plague and how it impacted Shakespeare. Now, before we get any further, as I am recording this video, I have approximately 150 subscribers, which is not very many, and I would love to increase the size of the community here who enjoy talking about and listening to people talk about Shakespeare. So if this is something that you enjoy, if you enjoy this video, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel. That would really show me support and let me know that people are interested in this content. And also, if you want to participate in the conversation, feel free to leave a comment, to like this video. If you want to be notified every time I record a video, make sure that you click the little bell icon. I only do a video about every month or so, so you won't get that many notifications if you do. But if you don't want to miss any, make sure you ring that little bell. So, with that aside, let's talk about the plague. So the purpose of this particular video is particularly timely. As I record this video in the month of March in the year 2020, the world is in the middle of a pandemic. It's a pandemic called the COVID-19 infection, which is caused by a novel coronavirus. And as of the recording of this video, there have been about 460,000 cases of the COVID-19 disease in the world, as well as about 21,000 deaths related from it. And here in the United States, we're up to about 70,000 cases and about 1,000 dead, and that number is increasing rapidly. In addition to that, I am a theater educator. That's my main job. And I'm also a theater generalist. So sometimes I'm an actor, sometimes I'm a director, a set builder, designer. And so many of my friends on social media, the people I interact with, are fellow theater educators and theater professionals. And the theater community has been deeply impacted by this pandemic because across the country and in many countries in the world, theaters have closed. And so actors are at least temporarily out of work. Theater owners are not bringing in any money at the moment. And so this pandemic has strongly impacted the art of theater at this time. And so that got me thinking about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare handled pandemics, because Shakespeare was living in a time and place where the plague was very common. And so the purpose of this video is to explore how Shakespeare and his country handled the pandemic of the plague and how it impacted his career and his life. And before we get any further, I do want to point out two very good books on the subject. I got a lot of the information for this video from these books, and I would be remiss not to mention them. The first book is The Plague in Shakespeare's London by F.P. Wilson. This is an older book. It's been around for quite some time, but a lot of really great information here. And then also Politics, Plague, and Shakespeare's Theatre by Leeds Barrell is another great book. I got some really great information from both of these books, and if you're really interested in this subject, these are two places to go for more than I will have time to say in this video. So now in this video, I want to talk about a few different subjects. I want to talk about how Shakespeare was impacted personally by the plague. Then I want to talk about how Shakespeare was impacted professionally by the plague. Third, I want to talk about the government actions in Elizabethan England and Jacobean England and how the plague was tied up with what the government did. Fourth, I want to take a look at just some numbers related to the plague during Shakespeare's lifetime. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what the lessons for today are for us. So, first, how was Shakespeare personally impacted by the plague? Well, Shakespeare was impacted personally quite substantially right from the moment of his birth. Shakespeare was born in the year 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, and at that time there was a bad case of the plague going through England. In fact, it hit his hometown particularly hard. The year of Shakespeare's birth, a quarter of the residents of Stratford-upon-Avon were killed by the plague. And so right from the start, Shakespeare's whole life is shaped by the plague. Not only that, Shakespeare lost 4 siblings to the plague. 2 sisters in their infancy, a sister who was, I believe, 7 years old at the time, and then also an adult brother who died at the age of 27 of the plague. And not only that, what probably impacted Shakespeare the most as a writer, I would assume, is that in the year 1596, Shakespeare lost his son Hamlet to the plague. And I'm sure, as a father myself, that he would have been impacted strongly by that. So, question number 2, how was Shakespeare's professional life shaped by the plague? Well, quite substantially, in fact. And in the big picture, Shakespeare's professional life was shaped by closures to the theaters of London during times of plague. Shakespeare was writing and performing primarily in London, though his companies did tour sometimes. More about that in a moment. But Shakespeare was primarily writing in London, and multiple times the London theaters closed down due to plague. Theaters were shut down for extended periods in the year 1593, the year 1603, and the year 1608. And not only during those years, but some other years as well. But those are the 3 main ones. During the 1593 closure, by the way, during that year, 1593, more than 15,000 people were killed in London alone from the plague. And London was not a huge city. London was less than 200,000 people. Less than 200,000 people, 15,000 were killed from the plague in 1 year. That is significant. But during that 1593 closure, Shakespeare turned away from writing plays for a short period of time and instead focused on writing long-form poetry. And during that time is when we get the poems Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucretia. And so we can thank or blame the plague for Shakespeare writing those particular poems at that time. After the 1593 closure, another impact on Shakespeare's professional life was that many theater companies that existed before the closure of 1593 no longer existed after the theaters opened up after the plague abated. That means that there was less competition, but there were, fewer theaters operating, which is very unfortunate. But that was an impact on Shakespeare's professional career. Another impact on Shakespeare's professional life is that when theaters in London closed due to plague, quite often theater companies would take their plays and tour them to the provinces. When plague was in full swing in London, it wasn't always as bad outside of London, and theaters might be closed in London, but people might still be able to travel and carry on as normal outside of London. And so the theater companies would pack up and head on out and perform in the provinces when they were able to do so. And so that impacted Shakespeare as well, because it required some changes to how they did things. Going from a resident company to a touring company, for anybody who's ever done that, is not necessarily the same thing. The next thing I want to look at in Shakespeare's career is a period of time, and that period of time is from 1603 to about 1610, because that is a stretch of time where the plague was on and off again pretty bad during this period of time. It was the worst in 1603, but it had ups and downs throughout this extended period of time. Theaters closed multiple times during this period, as we will discuss. But a couple of things that are interesting to note from this period is that Shakespeare wrote no comedies during this time. For whatever reason, after Shakespeare wrote Twelfth Night, which is generally accepted to have been written sometime around 1601, 1602, Shakespeare had a period of no comedies, at least no plays that could be clearly, easily identifiable as comedies. And And that's interesting to me how that correlates with this period of ups and downs in the plague in London. I don't know if we can directly attribute a lack of comedies to the heavy presence of the plague, but I can say for myself, certainly I could imagine a scenario where I was less inclined to write about lighthearted things during a time of heavy plague. He did write The Tempest just after this time, probably around 1611, which is just after this period. But even that, while it can be classified as a comedy, is not the lighthearted romp that, say, A Comedy of Errors is, or The Merry Wives of Windsor, or Twelfth Night, or anything like that. Another thing that's worth noting as it relates to Shakespeare's career and the plague is that Shakespeare uses the word plague an awful lot in his plays, not only in the period of 1603 to 1610, but throughout his career, he uses the word plague quite a lot. In fact, the word plague or plague-related language shows up in Shakespeare's canon 119 times. Either the word plague or plaguey or plague sore or things like that. And if we were to add to that list words like infect or infection, things like that, that number would be even higher. But specifically plague shows up 119 times. And that's quite a bit for a very specific word. And if you're interested, the two plays where that word shows up the most are Henry IV Part 1 and Timon of Athens. The word plague comes up an awful lot in both of those plays. Okay, so question number 3, how did the government handle this? What were some of the governmental actions related to the plague in Elizabethan and Jacobean England? Well, we have to look back a little bit because the plague had been turning up in England for hundreds of years. And so England had been grappling with the plague for a long time. And by the year 1518, English government officials had started to codify different plague orders for the purpose of prevention and abatement. And starting in that 1518 period, going on to about the year 1583, there were a lot of big changes to what they would do. But by about 1583, the actions that government officials would take were more or less kind of codified and solid. And there were some small changes that happened, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But here's some things that happened. First of all, when the plague was severe, the government plague orders required all large gatherings to be postponed, schools to be suspended, sporting events to be canceled, and theaters to be closed. Interestingly, though, they did not order churches to be closed. Churches were permitted to continue gatherings and worship even when the plague was at its worst. One caveat, though, is that people who were known to be infected with the plague were required to self-quarantine, so hopefully people who knew they had the plague would not be going to church. But even back then, during Shakespeare's time, we were practicing, social isolation, social distancing, as we call it today. That's a practice that goes way back even to Shakespeare's time and before. But then, starting in 1604, there came into existence a really specific trigger for when theaters would close. Starting in 1604, the closure of theaters was triggered when there were 30 or more plague-related deaths in London the week before. So, over a week's-long period of time, if there were 30 or more deaths from plague, then the following week the theaters would be closed. But then, in the year 1608, that number changed to 40 rather than 30, and I'm not sure why, and I don't think it's very clear to us today why that is, but that number did get raised to 40. Now, that threshold of 30 or 40, depending on the year, was met at least once every year from 1605 to 1610. Not in the year that it was written, in the year 1604, but the following year all the way through 1610, that threshold triggered a closure of the theaters at least once, and many years more than once. In addition to the closure of things, the theater threshold, and the stopping of social gatherings, also homes where there were infected residents were marked with a red cross. That indicated that there was a plague infection present in that home. And in fact, Shakespeare references that red cross mark in his comedy Love's Labour's Lost. And so there's a specific reference to that. Topic number 4, some numbers for you. So just like we here in the United States have suddenly been seeing a rapid increase of coronavirus cases, London saw rapid increases in the plague as well. So I just want to throw out a couple of numbers from the year 1603 when things were really bad. And by the way, these numbers I got from this Politics, Plague, and Shakespeare's Theatre book. These numbers are in here, and more numbers in addition to that. But let's take a look at the year 1603, and specifically the summer, late spring to late summer of 1603. So in the week that ended April 21st, there were 8 plague-related deaths in London. That's April 21st. Then, a month later, June 23rd, the week that ends June 23rd, there were 72 plague-related deaths. So over the course of a month, the plague deaths increased from 8 to 72. That's a substantial increase, but that's not an insane increase. But then the following week, the week after the week of June 23rd, when there were 72 deaths, the next week there were 158. So more than double in 1 week. And then 3 weeks after that, it goes up from 158 3 weeks prior to 917. So an increase from 158 to 917 deaths in London in the course of 3 weeks. Then if we snap towards the end of the summer, September 1st. So September 1st, end of the summer, 3,000 plus deaths due to the plague in the city of London in the year 1603. We go from 8 plague-related deaths April 21st in London to more than 3,000 plague-related deaths the week of September 1st. That's quite the uptick. And we're seeing something like that in the United States today. A rapid rise every day. That number of cases and that number of deaths seems to go up a pretty substantial amount. In addition to that, some other numbers. There were multiple months in a row, or multiple weeks in a row, I should say, of 100 plus deaths in the years 1606, 1607, 1608, and 1609. That's in addition to those 1603 numbers that I gave you. So the period of 1606 through 1609, that 4-year period, there were multiple weeks in a row of more than 100 deaths due to the plague. So Shakespeare was clearly living with plague quite substantially for an extended period of time. And now on to our 5th subject, which is lessons for today. What hope can we take from this? What value is there in taking a look at this? Because I know that the idea of a pandemic can be very scary, whether you're living with it, as I am as I record this video, or whether you're just looking at it from a safe distance. It can be dark and scary, and so what value is there in looking at it? And I've got a few things to say about that. And the first thing is that even though pandemics are new to us dealing with the coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak right now, they are not new to the human experience. And even though it is unpleasant, it does tie us to our own human history. And for me, I find that rather compelling. The second thing I want to say is I find it hopeful that the idea of social distancing has been used by humans for hundreds of years to combat outbreaks. And they have helped in the past, and they seem to be helpful today. And I think that's really great. That tool has been in the toolbox for so long. The third thing I want to say about this is that while the plague clearly had some impacts on Shakespeare's writing, such as compelling him to write some long-form poems rather than plays in 1593, to potentially limiting his interest in comedies when plague was really bad, to just, subliminally getting him to write the word plague in his plays and his poems many times, it did not stop him from writing. Even when he could not write plays, he kept writing, he kept working. And as somebody who is dealing with needing to stay home right now because of a pandemic, I find that to be a wonderful role model. And then the last thing I will say is this. The plague is a scary concept. It's a scary idea. And yet, some of the greatest works written in the English language came from Shakespeare during this time, when the plague was rampant. He wrote King Lear. He wrote Antony and Cleopatra. He wrote so many wonderful plays at a time when the plague was shutting things down and people were ill and it was really hard. And yet, beauty can still come from that time period, and not just beauty, but beauty for the ages. And for me, that gives me hope. So there you have it. That's how the plague impacted Shakespeare. If you liked this video, please remember to click like and subscribe and hit that little bell icon if you want to be notified whenever I make a new video. Also, if you have an idea for some content you would love to see me record, something you'd want me to talk about in an upcoming video, make sure you mention it in the comments below and I will be sure to take a look at that and consider it. And if you liked this video and you want to watch more videos about Shakespeare, you can watch more videos on my Our Shakespeare channel right now. Fare you well. I commend you to your own content.